Digital Foundry is proudly sponsored by the Logitech G935 headset.
In what feels like a homecoming of sorts, Resident Evil returns to a Nintendo platform with 3 new releases: Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil Remake, and Resident Evil 0. All 3 games started life on Nintendo GameCube and have now been ported to Switch, and the results are interesting. Resident Evil 4 is a full 3D game updated to run at a higher frame rate, while the other 2 rely on pre-rendered backgrounds. So, how do these games scale up on the Switch, and what kind of issues might you encounter? That's exactly what we're here to discuss today, and to join me is none other than the world-renowned Resident Evil expert and producer at Brave Wave, Alex Aniel, aka CVX Freak.
Hello everyone, how's it going?
It's going wonderful. We've both been playing a lot of Resident Evil lately, and, well, there's no better place to start than with Resident Evil 4, I think. This is, without a doubt, one of the finest horror action games ever made. Just perfect level design and pacing. I've already played through roughly half the game on the Switch during my capture sessions. And Alex, you've already finished it and might just be the first person in the world to have done so, outside of Capcom.
Yeah, actually. I got the game from the Australian eShop because they're ahead of most countries in terms of time zones. So their game unlocked at midnight. So I did an all-nighter and I beat the game in 7 hours. And when I uploaded my result to the leaderboard, I was the only one on there. So I assumed that I probably was the first one. I think I beat the game before the game opened up in North America as well.
Yeah, I think that's
so
right.
That probably has a lot to do with it, but it was funny seeing that.
That's great. And, I think a lot of us, at least for me, and I know you as well, like we were looking forward to playing Resident Evil 4 on the Switch. It's a great platform for it. And, the visual design and the look of the game is excellent for a handheld system. And yeah, first impressions are certainly positive. So since we're talking tech a little bit, I should probably start off with some of the resolution numbers here. So surprisingly, Resident Evil 4, despite being a somewhat older game, does not hit full 1080p on the Switch. Instead, it appears to run at 900p when in docked mode. And if you switch over to portable mode, it comes in at 600p instead. So not quite on par with the PS4 version.
Wow.
Still, despite that, it clearly is based on that version of the game. It has all the same, the look and assets and the upgrade in frame rate with the various sort of limitations and bugs as well. It's all there. But I guess the question for me then, for you, is how does it play compared to all the other versions? Because I think you've played to completion probably every version of Resident Evil 4. Where does the Switch version fall?
That's a good question. So obviously the Switch version's biggest differentiator from the previous versions is handheld play. And unfortunately, there are no gyro controls, which I think is a shame because I think it would have been a really good fit for it. So in handheld mode, obviously the game is the same in general. It's got the same everything, levels, modes, weapons, and so forth. So in that sense, it wasn't any different than playing another version, but seeing the game on a handheld for the first time obviously kind of brings up different feelings because you're looking at a small screen now. And
yeah, I mean, you're right. I think the handheld presentation is interesting in a case of something like this, where the assets were designed for the GameCube, so it's a 2005 game. Obviously, the textures, when viewed at higher resolution, they show their age. I mean, they look good artistically, but they're somewhat blurry. And all the other versions, playing it at a higher resolution on a large TV, and this obviously applies to the Switch as well, you really see that. But when you shrink it down to the portable format, it somehow sort of softens the impact of the lower resolution textures, and it just produces a really nice looking game. And obviously this PS4 Xbox PC version that this version is based on was all derived from the GameCube version, not the PS2 version, as we saw with some earlier ports. So all the lighting's there, everything you'd expect is here, and it looks good. Also interesting is the way texture filtering is handled. So in the original game on GameCube and on PlayStation 3 and the PS4 version, they did not use mipmaps, so you get a lot of shimmering at a distance, which kind of gives you the faux impression of an increased detail at a distance. But on the Switch, as you see here, they've actually implemented mipmaps this time, so there's less texture aliasing at a distance, though since the texture filtering setting isn't that high, there is some extra visible blur on the artwork itself, specifically at oblique angles. And I guess, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this as well. The thing that stood out to me is that they still don't quite have the aiming just right. Like, the dead zone on GameCube was perfect. It was extremely easy to line up very precise shots.
Yeah, it's hard to say because I did play Resident Evil 4 on 2 different Switches, a friend of mine's and my own, and the reason I did that was because my own Switch actually has a defective Joy-Con, which is a widespread problem. But I did realize early on that it was hard to do specific precision shots. The best example I can name would be the blue medallions that you have to shoot that are like hanging on trees. And if you don't have the sniper rifle, then you need to be very, very focused on where it is. And sometimes I would get close to that blue medallion, but the thing is, the stick wouldn't recognize some of the precise movements I was attempting to do, so there would be no response on the screen even though I was moving the Joy-Con ever so slightly. So I thought that was something quite noticeable, but it's something that exists in other modern versions as well, so I don't know if this is specifically a Switch-related problem.
No, you're right. It's just, this is the same issue that existed with previous ports. But in this case, so with the Pro controller, it does, to me at least, feel a lot like playing on PS4 or Xbox, but the nature of the Joy-Con, their size, the little tiny stick, I felt it was actually a little bit more tricky there, which is why gyro aiming would have been a really cool feature for the game. And honestly, also, while docked, I don't know how it would have worked, but it would have been neat to see the pointer controls from the Wii version added as an option, since the Joy-Con can function as like a motion controller in that sense. It could have at least worked like the Move implementation in Resident Evil 5 on PS3, because, obviously the Switch doesn't use an IR bar like the Wii, but you could still do interesting motion aiming, I think, as an option. So, that's kind of the limitations as I see it right there. It's a decent port visually. It looks like the PS4 and Xbox version at a slightly lower resolution, but the control options also are the same. It doesn't take advantage of the Switch in any interesting ways. So it's very straightforward. But there is a caveat to all of this, and that is performance. Now, I played this mostly in docked mode, and then I went back and replayed sections in portable mode. You played almost entirely, I think, in portable mode. Is that right?
Yeah, I went into docked mode for just a little bit, but I would say over 95% of my gameplay time was on handheld mode or in tabletop mode. So that would be my frame of reference.
So as somebody that doesn't necessarily measure frame rates for a living, what were your impressions of the performance here as a hardcore Resident Evil player?
I mean, it was definitely a very functional experience. I didn't get any particularly bad impressions from playing it in handheld mode on the Switch. As we're about to talk about, there was some slowdown in certain parts of the game, in certain situations, and it was surprising to see that, I think, because that wasn't really a big problem in most of the previous versions. So I think that's something to take into consideration. But I was able to beat the game from beginning to end in pretty much just one playthrough, and I had a blast. It felt like, now that it was on a handheld, it felt like playing the game all over again for the first time in some ways. So it was very satisfying on the whole.
Yeah. And I think you did the right thing by playing in portable mode, because that's where we see some differences. So let's talk about docked performance, though, because I think that's what a lot of users are curious about first. And the results are mixed, is a nice way to put it. So obviously, like the other versions, it targets 60 frames per second. It gets there pretty often, and most scenes feel pretty responsive and okay, but I basically kind of found out, running this through our tool, you can really see here that all of these major battles and sequences that you wind up in, the game just can't hold its target. So, like, it became, during the initial village, it wasn't so bad. You could see a few dips here and there, but I guess it's like chapter 1, 2. After you first meet the merchant, you go out into that sort of like valley area with all the bridges. It's a cool spot. And immediately the frame rate is dropping below 60 FPS, and it just can't seem to keep up. A bit later then, during fighting the boss in the lake, I saw exactly the same thing. Like, that one's not as big of a deal because of the way the controls are mixed up there, but again, slow down. Even coming back from that, once the rainstorm kicks up and you now have Ashley with you and you're trying to make your way down through the graveyard, again, it just can't hold that frame rate. And that's kind of the theme is throughout, up through, I guess, the castle. I've kind of tested bits and pieces from all over, and the results are pretty much like this. But again, I've picked the results where the performance was most obviously compromised. So this does kind of paint a more negative picture than reality, I suppose, by a little bit. Because it's still, you still get 60 FPS enough that it feels good. But I personally would have liked to have seen a 30 frames per second cap.
So that would have,
at least as an option.
That would have been just like the PS3 and 360 versions last gen, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, just as an option, just to get that consistency. And it feels more like the original game then as well. So, but portable mode, where you played it first, you had a good experience there, and that's because the performance is flat out just better. It's not perfect. There's still plenty of slowdown, but all the scenes that I tested, it stays much closer to the 60 FPS line, and it's more pleasant to play and experience in portable mode. And I think you very much felt that.
Absolutely, yeah. It was very, very playable. I never felt that the frame rate was working against me too much, and I think this was particularly a problem with Resident Evil Revelations 2 on Switch, which came out about 18 months ago. And I remember that game, sometimes the frame rate drops are very noticeable, and it can affect how the combat feels. But in Resident Evil 4, like, I can't recall any specific instance where the frame rate's dropping, and I felt like what I wanted to do just... I never felt that I was unable to do what I wanted to do specifically because of it. Was it noticeable? Absolutely, but it wasn't a deal breaker for me.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a good way to describe this port as a whole. It's good, but not perfect. And, I think it does satisfy that itch that we both had to play Resident Evil 4 on the go, which would have been cool to see on Vita as well, actually, I think. But it's a shame that never happened. But here we are.
Oh yeah, I mean after seeing Resident Evil: The Mercenaries 3D on 3DS 8 years ago, it looked worse than RE4.
Sure.
But I knew from that point a portable version of RE4 could have happened if they really wanted to. So I think, if anything, this is kind of a belated release. Like, even when it came to Wii U, Resident Evil 4 came to Wii U as an eShop download.
That's right, I forgot about that. They brought a bunch of standard Wii games over to Wii U, and I think in some cases they actually modified the controls even to make it work better with the system.
Exactly, but like Resident Evil 4 Wii Edition, when it came to the Wii U eShop, Capcom didn't do that. So you couldn't actually play it on the gamepad without using a Wii remote. So it was actually pretty unfortunate. Like, it wouldn't have been truly portable, but it could have been a way to enjoy Resident Evil 4 on a small screen away from your big TV.
That's true.
That didn't happen either. So I'm glad that we finally have a fully portable version of one of the best video games of all time.
Absolutely. I stand by that 100%. It's one of the best games ever made, and kudos to the original developers for that. But it's not the only Resident Evil game to have arrived on Switch this week. The other two are much closer in terms of technical makeup, but we'll discuss them both. First, there is Remake. Resident Evil Remake. This hit the GameCube not too long after launch. I think it was like mid to early 2002. And it blew everyone away. This is when Capcom's deals with Nintendo were starting to become evident. They were getting a lot of games. And yeah, this was one of the finest uses of pre-rendered backgrounds I've ever seen. And it was later then ported to HD consoles with some changes made to the way they handle the backgrounds. And that is the version that's been ported here. And, well, what do you think, Alex?
Yeah, Remake is fantastic on Switch. More so than RE4, I think. I think it looks good in handheld mode, especially. When blown up on the TV in dock mode, I mean, I think it looks a little bit grainier than the PS4 version. But other than that, there aren't really any major differences. I think the biggest point of contention for me might be the loading times in specific rooms early on in the game. You'll encounter situations where you'll see the classic door opening sequence, and unfortunately the original sequence that was designed for the game isn't long enough to go the length of the time the Switch needs to load the next room. So you'll see the door sequence finish, but you'll see like a black screen and a blood splattering loading icon in the bottom right corner.
Yeah, that is kind of a big deal, actually, because the nature of this game is that you do sort of wander back and forth through the mansion, so you're constantly using doorways. And that extra loading that pops up for specific rooms is quite a drag on just the general pacing of the game. And that is kind of a downgrade from the other versions.
Yeah, I played Resident Evil Remake HD on PS3 and PS4 actually, and I can't even remember the PS3 version having loading times this bad. So
exactly, me neither. So it's a strange thing, but at least on the positive side, unlike Resident Evil 4, this one does seem to output at full 1080p. I mean, at least for the characters in docked mode. So it's very sharp, it's very clean, and even with blowing things up, you can still kind of appreciate what they were able to achieve here with all the animation and the reflections and the shadows. It really does hold up. But as you said, it does kind of hold up better in portable mode, because the nature of running on a smaller screen means that the flaws in the pre-rendered backgrounds are a heck of a lot less noticeable.
Right. When they're that small, I think, to my eyes, they look just as beautiful as they did back in 2002. Remake.
Exactly.
I think Capcom lost most, if not all, the source code for Remake, which is why it took them so long to remaster it. But obviously, the remastering involved a lot of upscaling and blowing up images. Some of the rooms,
I mean, they did a little more than that. In some rooms, they sort of remade certain rooms in a weird way.
Right.
But you're right. But I guess it is what it is. There's only so much you can do without the original source files. The only real qualm I would level with the game is that the performance issues are the same as they were like on PS4. Basically, there's like sort of a frame persistence problem, like bad frame pacing, if you will. It's not a big deal because the camera doesn't really move in this game, but just walking around the mansion, I'm sure you notice this as well. You can just sort of see a slight stutter sometimes to your character.
Yes, and there's no rhyme or reason to it. It can happen when the character's by him or herself, or it can happen when there are enemies in the room. So it's really unfortunate they couldn't fix that. I don't know if that's a problem with the game engine or the hardware.
Yeah, it's definitely a strange thing, and we've seen this with other games as well. But I guess aside from the frame persistence issue, I did notice that occasionally certain cutscenes do drop some additional frames and don't look quite as smooth as they should, like this one here in the bathroom. But yeah, other than that, though, I mean, for the most part, it's really good. So obviously then, aside from Remake, there's also Resident Evil 0, which shares a lot of elements with Remake, but looks a bit better overall, I think, in terms of the way they were able to upscale some of the backgrounds. But on Switch, this one has a pretty nasty problem with loading that is a lot worse than what Remake has going on.
Yeah, so, I mean, Resident Evil 0 was always a more advanced game in terms of, I guess, technical capabilities than the Remake. It had a higher budget back in the day, so I think it doesn't surprise me that it has longer loading times, but the implementation in this particular port is actually pretty bad. Basically, I would say over 75% of the rooms in the game have loading times that are longer than their standard door sequences. But visually, in terms of the implementation, with the Remake, the door loading sequences would finish up and the screen would go black and you would get that blood splattering icon.
Yeah, exactly.
So I mean, it's not ideal, but I mean, visually it looks professionally done, if that makes sense. But with Zero, the really odd thing is that the door loading sequence will finish, but the door will stop animating. It'll look like the game froze. Like the door is like swung open, and like the same blood icon will appear on the bottom right. And like when I first saw it, I thought my game had frozen. My Switch has frozen in the past, so like I thought maybe that would have been the same issue, but it's not. Like the game is just loading everything, and for whatever reason, they were unable to use a black screen after the sequence was done loading.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean that's kind of a downer.
It looks incredibly tacky in an otherwise like presentationally very solid game. Like I always thought Resident Evil 0 had like slick menus, very nice sound effects, but this kind of actually makes it stand out in a very negative way. I think
looking at all three ports then together, Resident Evil 0 is the one that sticks out as the one I would least recommend for that reason alone. I mean, the loading times aren't that much different than Remake at its worst, but the difference is that the black screen in Remake only appears when entering certain rooms. Most of them are actually quite fast, whereas in 0, there's more doors in general, and all of them take a long amount of time to load. So as a result, just running around through the game just doesn't feel as good. So yeah, I would definitely recommend checking out Remake on Switch, but 0 still maybe not. And Resident Evil 4, while certainly far from perfect, it's still very reasonable, especially if you're playing in handheld mode. So it's kind of a mixed bag overall. Like the results are good, but not stunning.
Yeah, like with Resident Evil 0 in particular, I mean, the pacing of that game has always been very controversial for Resident Evil fans because of the item dropping system, the two characters, and the low item capacity that each character has, and all the backtracking.
Yeah,
so
there's so much backtracking to get items, item management. It's a pain.
If you pile on the really long load times that rival the Resident Evil Outbreak games, then it's hard recommending people play it on the Switch on the go if they have another Resident Evil game on the system. You know,
which fortunately they do. There are several on the Switch right now, and all of the other ones, except for maybe Revelations 2, I would recommend over 0, just from a technical standpoint.
Right.
But, you know, I think that pretty much covers everything about it. It's, you know, they're interesting ports, some good parts, some bad parts, but still worth checking out overall, I'd say, except for maybe 0. But yeah, so I guess that's going to wrap it up for the moment. Thanks for joining me here, Alex.
Right. Thanks a lot. Hope to be back on soon.
Absolutely. And if you guys enjoyed this video, as always, be sure to like and subscribe, ring the notification bell up at the top, and follow us over on Twitter. And until next time, this is John signing off.
Featuring 2.4 GHz wireless, 50mm Pro G audio drivers, and DTS Headphone X 2.0 surround sound technology under the hood, the G935 headset delivers the ultimate wireless audio solution for gamers, whether you're playing on PC, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, Nintendo Switch, or mobile. Order yours today from Logitech G.